The village of Oakhaven clung to the hillsides like a frightened child to its mother's skirt. Above it, on the very crest of the ridge, stood the stone mass of St. Giles' Church. On clear days, its spire seemed to pierce the heavens. In foul weather, it seemed to draw every storm to itself. Father Alaric, who had served here for only 6 months, still couldn't get used to the oppressive silence, broken only by the rustle of wind in the ancient oaks and the creak of the weather vane on the tower. The priest had come from the bustling, light-filled city of York, where the hum of voices never ceased and church bells were part of the urban symphony. But here, the bell of St. Giles, a massive thing of time-darkened bronze, nicknamed Gabriel by the parishioners, was silent. It had been silent ever since its lifelong bell-ringer had died. That night, a storm fell upon Oakhaven with a fury that not even the old-timers could recall. The wind howled in the chimney of the priest's modest home, and rain lashed at the shutters as if 100 bony fingers were trying to claw their way inside. Alaric sat by the light of a single candle, trying to focus on the lines of the Psalter, but his thoughts kept drifting away, carried off by the shrieking gale. It was then, in a brief moment of quiet when the wind momentarily lost its grip, that the sound reached him. Dong! A deep, solitary, impossibly mournful toll of the bell. The sound cut through the howl of the storm, low and vibrating, and settled somewhere deep in his soul, leaving an icy trail in its wake. Alaric froze, his head lifted. Had he imagined it? A trick of the mind, spurred on by the weather? The old tower, the dry beams, a gust of wind could have swayed the bell's clapper. Yes, that must have been it. The priest tried to convince himself, turning back to the holy book, but his fingers trembled slightly, and his eyes slid over the parchment, unseeing. He waited, not knowing for what. A second toll never came. The silence was once again filled only by the roar of the storm. But that single, mournful sound had already taken root in his mind. It had been too clear, too intentional. As if someone had wanted to announce something but had only enough strength for a single strike. Sleep would not come. Alaric tossed and turned on his hard bed, and every time the wind slammed against the wall, he imagined he heard an echo of that bronze groan. Who could be in the belfry on a night like this? No one. The tower door was always locked with a heavy iron key that he kept in his dresser drawer. Not a living soul could get in. The morning greeted Oakhaven with silence and devastation. Uprooted trees, tiles torn from roofs. But the sky was clear and pale, as if washed clean. The first thing Alaric did, after swallowing a piece of stale bread, was head to the church. Inside, a cold gloom reigned, smelling of damp stone and incense. His footsteps echoed under the vaulted ceiling as he walked down the nave. The priest stopped before the low, iron-bound door that led to the belfry. From the pocket of his cassock, he produced the massive key. The lock yielded with a long, drawn-out screech. A spiral staircase disappeared upwards into the darkness. Alaric was enveloped by the smell of coal dust, bird droppings, and something else, something as old as the earth itself. Ascending the worn stone steps, he ran his hand along the wall, feeling its deathly chill. At the top, in the bell chamber, grey shafts of morning light pierced through the narrow arrow-slit windows. Cobwebs hung in tatters everywhere, and the floor was littered with feathers and dry twigs. The colossal Gabriel hung in the center, motionless and majestic in its silence. Its bronze sides were coated with a greenish patina. The thick rope hanging from its clapper was neatly coiled and fastened to the wall, covered in the same thick layer of dust as everything else. Not a single trace. No footprints in the dusty floor, no sign that the rope had been touched. Everything was as it should be. As it had been for months, if not years. "That was a wicked night, Father," a creaky voice called from below. Alaric flinched and turning saw the head of old Finn, the cemetery keeper, on the stairs. His wrinkled face was full of curiosity. "Yes, Finn, the Lord has shown his wrath," the priest replied, descending to meet him. "I was just checking to see if everything was all right. It seemed to me, last night. Seemed to you that our Gabriel decided to speak up?" The old man squinted slyly. Alaric looked at him in surprise. "You heard it too?" Finn nodded slowly, his expression turning serious. "Nights like that awaken old bones. And old memories. I heard it. One told. Just like 20 years ago, when we buried Elias." "Elias?" Alaric repeated. He had heard the name but didn't know the details. "The bell ringer," Finn explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He served Gabriel for 50 years. Knew its soul better than his own. Used to say that every bell has a soul. When Elias died, as a sign of special respect, they didn't bury him in the cemetery, but right here, directly under the flagstones of the nave." The old man pointed a bony finger down towards the central aisle of the church. "No one's been up here since then, Father. No reason to. The key's with you, after all." Alaric swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat. He looked at the dusty rope, at the motionless clapper. "It must have been the wind," he said, more to himself than to Finn. "A strong gust." The old keeper chuckled, but there was no mirth in his eyes. "Perhaps, Father. Perhaps. Except the wind doesn't lock the door behind itself with a key." Finn's words hung in the cold air of the belfry, sharp and heavy as shards of ice. The gravedigger turned and, without another word, began his slow, shuffling descent down the spiral staircase, leaving Alaric alone with the silent bronze giant and his own, increasingly troubled thoughts. The priest scanned the dusty chamber one more time. His entire being, his education, and his faith screamed that there had to be a logical explanation. His rational mind clung to any possibility, a trick of the ear, a resonance caused by the storm, even someone's cruel prank, though he couldn't imagine who, or, more importantly, how, they could have pulled it off. Alaric descended, and the sound of his own footsteps on the stone steps seemed uncertain. Locking the tower door, he turned the key twice in the lock. The loud click echoed through the empty nave, like a final word in a conversation he didn't want to continue. The priest's gaze fell involuntarily to the stone slabs of the floor. He walked slowly down the central aisle, peering at the seams between them, searching for any sign. Which one was it? Which one concealed the remains of a man so devoted to his work that not even death could separate him from his place of service? About halfway down the nave, Alaric noticed one slab that was slightly different from the others. It was made of the same gray, veined stone, but its edges seemed less worn, as if it had been walked on less frequently than its neighbors. Or as if it had once been lifted and then set back in place, disturbing the age-old pattern of dust and grime in the cracks. He froze above it, and it seemed to him that a faint chill was seeping from beneath the stone, a smell of damp earth and decay. The day passed in a fog. Alaric tried to distract himself with his usual duties. He visited the miller's sick widow, sorted through donations, and checked the church vessels for damage after the storm. But no matter who he spoke to, he saw the shadow of the previous night in their eyes. The village was buzzing like a disturbed hive. Not everyone, but many, had heard the single toll of the bell. Old Martha, who brought him a crust of still-warm bread, crossed herself as soon as she spoke of it. "It's Elias, Father," she whispered, her eyes wide with superstitious terror. "His soul finds no peace. Gabriel is calling to him, or maybe he's calling to one of us. It's a death knell. Trouble is coming." Alaric tried to calm her, speaking of God's will and the folly of giving in to pagan fears. But his words sounded unconvincing even to himself. Later at the forge he met Thomas, the village headman. Broad-shouldered, with hands that could bend a horseshoe, Thomas was a man of the earth, pragmatic and not given to flights of fancy. "The wind, Father," he boomed, wiping soot from his face. "Or a clap of thunder that sounded like a bell. The people of Oakhaven love their tales. Pay it no mind. Elias was a good man, but he's dead and buried, as we all will be. The dead are silent." Thomas's words were a balm to Alaric's troubled soul. He desperately wanted to believe them. The dead are silent. It was one of the pillars of his faith. The soul departs to the Lord, and the body turns to dust. Period. But as dusk fell, the doubts returned with renewed force. The church, his sanctuary and the house of God, seemed alien and sinister in the advancing shadows of the night. The shadows dancing in the corners from the candlelight took on bizarre shapes, and every creak of the old wood made the priest jump. Unable to find peace, he decided to search for answers in the past. In the sacristy, in a heavy oak chest, the parish books were kept, thick, leather-bound tomes filled with the faded ink of his predecessors. He leafed through the yellowed pages, inhaling the scent of dust and time. Births, baptisms, marriages, deaths, a whole chronicle of Oakhaven's lives and sorrows. Finally, in a book from 20 years ago, he found what he was looking for. Written in the neat but clearly trembling hand of Father Simeon, the priest who had served here before him, was an entry. On the 20th day of October in the year of our Lord 1666, departed the servant of God, Elias Gray, who served as bell ringer at this church for 53 years. His body, according to his last will and with the bishop's permission, has been committed to the earth not in the consecrated cemetery, but beneath the slabs of the nave, so that even in death he may be near his bell. His soul was bound to the voice of Gabriel by unbreakable ties. May the Lord grant his soul rest, and may he have mercy on us. The last phrase, "May he have mercy on us," was atypical for such an entry. It broke from canon. In it, one could feel a personal, genuine anxiety. Alaric traced a line with his finger. What had frightened Father Simeon so much? Night descended on the village. Unlike the previous one, it was quiet and clear. A full moon bathed the land in a silvery, deathly light. Alaric could not sleep. An unknown force pulled him back to the church. Throwing a cloak over his nightshirt and taking a candle, he stepped out into the cold night. Inside the church, it was even colder. Moonlight, filtering through the stained glass windows, painted colorful, ghostly patterns on the stone floor. He walked to the very spot, to the slab under which he was now certain Elias rested. Alaric stopped, listening to the silence. The silence was absolute. No wind, no creaks. Only the beating of his own heart. And then he heard it. At first, it was a barely discernible rustle, one that could be mistaken for the scurrying of mice. But then it grew clearer. It was the sound of stone grating against stone. A slow, intermittent, scraping sound. And it was coming from under the floor, directly beneath his feet. Alaric froze, becoming all ears. The blood in his veins turned to ice. The scraping repeated, this time louder, more insistent. As if someone, or something, down there in the cramped grave, was trying to move an impossibly heavy weight. He stood, paralyzed by terror, unable to move or make a sound. Suddenly, a passing cloud covered the moon, and the church was plunged into almost total darkness. And in that very moment, in the dead silence that followed, it came again. Dong! A single, heart-wrenching toll of the bell. This time there was no storm, no wind to blame for the sound. It rang out in the windless night, clear, sharp, and full of an unspeakable sorrow. The echo of the toll had not yet faded under the vaults when Alaric heard a new sound, one that made the hair on his head stand on end. The distinct, long groan of heavy stone being slowly pushed from its place. Instinct triumphed over faith, reason, and duty. A primal terror, one that knew neither prayers nor logic, struck Alaric in the legs and made him run. He spun around, stumbled in the darkness, and the candle, falling from his trembling hand, rolled across the stone floor and went out. Now the priest was in complete darkness, deafened by the pounding of his own heart, while behind him, the unbearable, scraping sound of the moving gravestone continued. He fled by touch, tripping over pews, slamming his shoulder into cold stone columns. The air seemed thick and heavy, filled with the smell of disturbed grave soil. He felt as if something was pursuing him, something slow but relentless, born of dust and despair. Alaric didn't dare look back. He knew that if he turned around, he would see something that would steal his sanity. Finally, his hands found the rough wood of the main door. He desperately fumbled for the massive iron bolt. His fingers wouldn't obey, slipping on the cold metal. Behind him, the scraping stopped. Silence fell. A silence that was more terrifying than any sound. Alaric froze for a moment, listening. He heard nothing, but he felt it. He felt a presence, the presence of one who was no longer bound by the earth. With a desperate wrench, the priest finally lifted the heavy bolt. The door creaked open, letting a sliver of life-saving moonlight into the church. Without closing it behind him, Alaric stumbled outside into the cool night air and, without stopping, ran to his small house. He slammed the door shut, threw every bolt he had, and leaned against it, breathing heavily, like a cornered animal. He spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, clutching a crucifix to his chest. He prayed, but the prayers were disjointed, fragments of psalms and desperate pleas addressed to a God who now seemed so very far away. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside the window made him flinch. He waited. He waited for a knock on his door, or to hear the single toll of the bell again. But the night remained silent. When the first gray rays of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shutters, Alaric was exhausted. He hadn't slept a minute. Fear had given way to a heavy, leaden fatigue and the realization that he couldn't hide forever. He was the shepherd of this village, and whatever now inhabited his church was his responsibility. Summoning all his will, Alaric opened the door. The morning was quiet and peaceful. Birds were singing, and lights were appearing in the windows of the village. Everything was as usual, a stark contrast to the horror he had endured. It was as if the nightmare had dissipated with the first rays of the sun. But the priest knew that wasn't the case. With a heavy heart he headed towards the church. The main door was still ajar, a gaping black hole. He crossed himself and stepped inside. In the morning light that streamed into the nave, everything looked almost normal. But only almost. His gaze immediately fell to the center of the nave. Elias's gravestone had been moved. Not completely, but one of its edges was raised and shifted aside by about a foot, revealing a narrow slit of absolute, impenetrable blackness. A chill and the smell of damp clay emanated from it. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. From the dark opening in the floor, a trail stretched across the stone slabs. A trail of damp earth and something that looked like decayed fabric. It wasn't a clear path, but rather a broken, smeared trail, as if something had been dragged across the floor. And this trail led directly to one place. To the low, iron-bound door that led to the belfry. Alaric slowly approached the tower door. It was closed. With a trembling hand, he reached for the pocket of his cassock. The key was there. He had locked it yesterday. But the trail ended right at the foot of the door. His mind couldn't process it. It had come out of the grave. It had crossed the entire nave. And it had entered a locked tower? The rational mind, the one that had so desperately clung to the idea of the wind, was dead. Alaric was looking at undeniable, monstrous proof. Thomas's words, "The dead are silent," now sounded like a cruel joke. Elias was not silent. And he was no longer in his grave. Something had to be done. But what? Tell the villagers? They would either laugh at him or fall into a panic that would lead to no good. Contact the bishop? What would he write in a letter? "Your Excellency, a dead man has climbed out of his grave and is now living in my belfry." No. First, he had to understand what he was facing. And for that, he needed someone who knew the old stories. Someone who hadn't been surprised to hear the bell. He left the church, pulling the door tightly shut behind him, and headed towards the cemetery on the outskirts of the village. He found Finn where he expected to, slowly tidying up an old, leaning grave. The old man looked up as the priest approached, and there was no surprise in his faded eyes. It was as if he had been expecting this visit. "Was it a hard night, Father?" he asked, setting aside his shovel. His voice was even, without a hint of mockery. "You know, Finn," Alaric breathed out. He was no longer trying to hide anything. "You know more than you let on. The slab, it's been moved." Finn nodded slowly. He looked at the church, looming on the hill, and his face became as hard as the stone he had worked with his entire life. "I knew that night would change everything. He's been waiting too long. Who is he? What is happening?" Desperation broke through in Alaric's voice. "Not who, Father." "What?" the old man corrected him. The thing that was buried under that slab stopped being Elias many years ago. And the thing that yesterday's toll awoke, it's hungry. And it hasn't come for us. It has come for its bell. Finn's words hit Alaric with the force of a physical blow. Hungry, come for its bell. These were words from a world of pagan fairy tales, from the dark beliefs the church had spent centuries trying to eradicate. And they were being spoken by an old gravedigger, standing among crosses and tombstones, like a guardian on the border between two worlds. I don't understand, Alaric admitted honestly, his voice barely a whisper. What do you mean, it stopped being Elias? He was a pious man. He served the church his entire life. Finn stuck his shovel into the earth and leaned against it, crossing his calloused hands. The morning sun lit his wrinkled face, but his eyes remained in shadow. Pious? Perhaps. But his faith was directed at a slightly different god than the one you serve, Father. His god was the lump of bronze hanging in your tower. He didn't serve the church. He served Gabriel. The old man nodded toward the low stone wall of the cemetery. Let's sit, Father. This story isn't for tired legs. They sat on the cold, moss-covered stones. The morning silence surrounded them, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. I was just a boy then, Finn began, gazing somewhere into the distance, at the tip of the church spire. But I remember Elias well. He was strange. Not evil, no. But obsessed. He would talk to the bell when he thought no one could hear him. He would caress it, polish it until it shone, as if it were a living thing. He didn't call the ringing just a sound, but a voice. And he said that only he, Elias, understood what that voice was saying. Alaric listened, and a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air slowly spread through his body. The people in the village respected him, but they also feared him. Especially toward the end of his life. He grew thin, withered, his eyes burning with a feverish fire. He barely ate or slept, spending all his time in the belfry. He said Gabriel demanded more and more of his strength. That the voice was getting louder and needed sacrifices. Sacrifices? The priest repeated, the word getting stuck in his throat. At first it was birds, Finn grimaced. Pigeons, crows. He would bring them up there, dead. Said that bronze loves blood, that it makes the voice clearer. Father Simeon, your predecessor, tried to forbid him from going up to the tower. But Elias flew into such a rage, screaming that they were separating him from his soul, that without him Gabriel would die, and the whole village with it. He was strong, despite his thinness. The strength of obsession. The old man fell silent, chewing his toothless gums. And then he died. They found him right there, in the belfry. He had tied the bell rope around himself and, apparently, tried to ring it, but his heart gave out. He was lying at the foot of Gabriel with a smile on his face. Father Simeon was terrified. He wanted to bury him here, in the cemetery, as far from the church as possible. But Elias's will, which he had left with the headman, was different. He wanted to lie in the nave, to always hear the breath of his master. The village insisted. And Father Simeon, a gentle man, gave in. And that's when he wrote in the book, "May he have mercy on us," Alaric guessed. Exactly, Finn confirmed. Because he knew he wasn't just burying the body of a bell ringer in consecrated ground. He was burying the seed of something terrible. Elias, with his obsession, his heretical faith, his blood, he fed something. Something ancient that had slept in this hill long before the church was built here. He turned the bell into an idol, and himself into its priest. And when he died, that something entered his empty shell. It slept for 20 years, Father. As silent as its bell. But the storm, and that single toll, they woke it up. But what does it want? Alaric asked, though he already feared the answer. It's hungry, Finn repeated, and his gaze became heavy and direct. 20 years without food. It needs strength. The kind of strength found in sound. In a special sound. Elias believed that if you strike the bell at a certain hour, on a certain day, with the right force, its voice could tear the veil between worlds. The thing sitting in your tower now believes it too. It doesn't just want to ring. It wants to perform its priest's ultimate ritual. And for that, it needs more than the blood of birds. Alaric jumped to his feet. The picture, monstrous in its clarity, appeared before his eyes. The trail from the grave. The locked door. The creature that was now upstairs, next to the bell. What do we do? His voice broke. Reconsecrate the church? Perform an exorcism? Finn slowly rose, leaning on his shovel. His face was grim. I'm afraid holy water and prayers will be powerless here, Father. The thing sitting there has grown too deep into the stones of this place. It has become part of the church. Part of the bell. You can't exorcise a shadow cast by the tower itself. But there must be a way. We can't just wait. We certainly can't wait. The old man agreed. It's gathering strength. And as soon as it's strong enough to swing Gabriel's clapper properly, it will call. And I don't know what will answer its call. But I know that the village of Oakhaven will be the first to hear that answer. Suddenly a scream came from the direction of the village. Not loud, but a short, panicked shriek from a woman that was cut off abruptly. Alaric and Finn exchanged a look. The air grew tense. The silence that followed was unnatural. Even the crow that had been cawing in the distance fell silent. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath in anticipation. And then they heard it. Dong! Again. A single toll. But this time it was different. Not mournful, like in the night. It had strength. Confidence. And something else, anticipation. As if someone hadn't just struck the bell, but was testing its voice, warming up for a coming symphony of terror. The vibration from the bell's toll seemed to travel through the very ground beneath their feet. It was dense, physically palpable. Without a word, Alaric and Finn started running. Down the slope from the cemetery, along the path leading to the first houses of Oakhaven. The priest stumbled in his long cassock, but surprisingly, the old gravedigger kept up, his sinewy legs moving with unexpected agility. The scream had come from the direction of the forge. When they ran into the village square, they saw what they had feared. Thomas, the headman, was standing at the door of the forge. His huge body was tense, his face, usually red from the heat of the furnace, had turned an ashen gray. He stared at the open door of his house, which adjoined the forge, and didn't move. Worried neighbors were already gathering around. Thomas! What happened? Alaric shouted, running up to him. The blacksmith slowly turned his head. His eyes were empty. Elspeth, he rasped. She went out to the well for water. I was in the forge. I heard her scream. I ran out, and she's gone. Alaric looked inside the house. An overturned bucket lay on the earthen floor, the water from it spreading in a dark stain. Elspeth's shawl lay nearby. Nothing else. No signs of a struggle, no blood. She had simply vanished. Maybe she ran into the woods scared of something? Someone in the crowd suggested. She wouldn't have left the bucket. And she wouldn't have screamed like that. Thomas snapped, his voice beginning to regain its former strength, but now it rang with the steel of rage and fear. He shifted his gaze to Alaric, then to the church visible on the hill. And that bell. Right after she screamed. What's happening, Father? All eyes turned to the priest. Dozens of pairs of eyes, full of fear and questions, bored into him. They were waiting for an answer, for comfort, for an explanation. But what could he tell them? The truth? That a reanimated bell ringer had abducted the headman's wife to sacrifice her to a pagan deity trapped in the bell? They would burn him at the stake along with the church. A beast, said Finn, stepping forward. Everyone looked at him. There was a storm last night. It could have scared a wolf, or even a bear down from the hills. It came into the village looking for easy prey. A frightened whisper ran through the crowd. The explanation was simple, understandable, and for that reason, even more terrifying. But it was better than an inexplicable horror. We need to gather the men and search the woods, shouted Thomas, clutching at the version Finn offered like a drowning man clutching a straw. He grabbed a heavy hammer from the forge wall. Immediately! The men, armed with pitchforks and axes, formed a party and, led by the blacksmith who was mad with grief, moved towards the forest. The women, weeping and wailing, took the children into their homes, bolting the doors behind them. The square emptied. Only Alaric and Finn remained. "You lied to them," Alaric said quietly. "I gave them an enemy they can see and hit with an axe." The old man replied, not looking at him. "It's more merciful than telling them the real enemy is sitting above their heads in the house of God and can't even be touched." "But it changes nothing," Alaric exclaimed. "While they're looking for a wolf in the woods, the thing in the tower is getting stronger. Finn, you said it needed blood for a ritual." "Elspeth's blood." Finn finally turned to him. His face was like a mask of sorrow carved from stone. "I'm afraid, father, it's already too late for young Elspeth." Her scream was cut short. And the bell tolled. It has already gotten what it wanted. An icy chill ran down Alaric's spine. He imagined the horrific scene at the top of the tower, in the dusty chamber, next to the silent bronze behemoth. "So it will wait now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No," Finn shook his head. "It won't wait. It has gained strength. The strength for the first true ringing. Tonight, father. Tonight it will begin its ritual. And we have to stop it." "But how? You said yourself that prayers are powerless." "Prayers, yes. But not men." A hard glint appeared in the old man's eyes. "This creature was once human. It's tied to its body, even if it's decayed. And it's tied to its idol. If we want to silence it, we must silence Gabriel. Forever." Alaric understood what he meant. The idea was blasphemous, monstrous. To desecrate a consecrated bell, the heart of the church. "We can't destroy it. It's a sacred object." "It's not a sacred object anymore." Finn cut him off sharply. "It's an altar upon which a human sacrifice was made. It's the throat of a monster that is about to spew hell upon us. Choose, father. Will you save a lump of bronze, or the souls of this entire village?" Alaric looked at the empty square, at the forest where the men had gone in a futile search for a beast, at the locked doors of the houses behind which frightened women and children were hiding. He was their shepherd, and his duty was to protect his flock, at any cost. "What do we need?" he asked firmly. Finn looked at Thomas's forge, where the fire in the furnace was still glowing. "The heaviest hammer we can find. And steel wedges. And we'll also need your key to the tower. Tonight, as soon as the sun sets, we go up. And either we shatter that damned bell, or it will toll for our souls." The day died a slow, agonizing death. The sun, sinking behind the wooded hills, stained the sky in shades of crimson and violet, as if a massive bloodstain was spreading across it. A ringing silence reigned in Oakhaven. No one worked in the fields, no children's voices could be heard. Doors and shutters were tightly closed. The village was holding its breath, like a small animal that has scented a predator. Alaric and Finn acted quickly and silently. While the men, led by Thomas, were still combing the forest, they slipped into the empty forge. The air was thick with the smell of coal, sweat, and hot metal. Finn chose the largest sledgehammer he could lift, its handle polished to a shine by the blacksmith's hands. Alaric found a sack of heavy steel wedges used for splitting stone. Taking an oil lantern as well, they left the forge like two conspirators on their way to commit sacrilege in the name of salvation. They waited in the priest's small house until the last rays of sunlight faded from the horizon. Alaric tried to pray, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he, a servant of God, go to destroy what had been consecrated by his own predecessors? But then he remembered Thomas's empty eyes, the overturned bucket, and the trail of grave dirt on the church floor. And his resolve hardened. "It's time," Finn said, when the window was completely dark. They stepped out into the deepening twilight. The church on the hill loomed black against the darkened sky, its spire like a finger threatening the heavens. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Inside the church, it was cold and silent. The only source of light was their lantern, snatching rows of pews, the altar, and the ominous gap in the floor where the gravestone had been moved from the darkness. The smell of decay and damp earth had grown thicker. They approached the tower door. Alaric took out the key. His hand trembled so much that he couldn't immediately find the keyhole. Finally, the lock yielded with a screech. As soon as the door opened, a stench hit them. It was a thick, nauseating smell of rotting flesh, stale blood, and that same grave dampness. The smell was so dense it felt like you could touch it. "Lord, have mercy," Alaric whispered, covering his mouth with the sleeve of his cassock. Finn just spat grimly on the floor. "It's waiting for us." Lifting the lantern higher, Alaric stepped onto the spiral staircase first. Finn followed, his heavy footsteps dragging the sledgehammer behind him. Their steps echoed off the stone walls, mixing with their own heavy breathing. The higher they climbed, the stronger the stench became. And then they began to hear sounds. It wasn't a roar or a moan. It was something far more gruesome. A quiet, dry rustling, like the sound of autumn leaves. And a wet, scraping sound, as if someone was dragging a damp cloth across the floor. Alaric froze, raising a hand to listen. The sounds were coming from directly above their heads, from the bell chamber. It was there. And it knew they were coming. Gathering the last of his courage, the priest continued his ascent. The final steps. The wooden door to the chamber was ajar. No light came from the crack, only darkness and the stench. Alaric pushed the door with his shoulder. The lantern light cut through the darkness. The first thing they saw was Gabriel. Huge, black, it hung in the center, but its bronze surface was not just dark. It was wet, glistening, as if it had been smeared with something thick and dark. Droplets hung from its lower edge. Beneath the bell, on the dusty floor, lay what was left of Elspeth. Her body was broken and twisted into an unnatural position, her clothes torn. But that was not the worst of it. Standing next to her was a figure. It was what had once been Elias. A tall, desiccated creature, covered in gray, parchment-like skin. Tattered shreds of a burial shroud hung from it. Its arms were long and thin, with disproportionately large hands and fingers that looked like claws. They were black with dried blood. It had no face, just a skin-covered skull with empty eye sockets, in the depths of which burned two tiny, red embers, full of inhuman hatred and intelligence. The creature was not looking at them. It stood with its back to them, one of its clawed hands slowly, almost lovingly, stroking the wet side of the bell. The rustling they had heard was the sound of its decayed shroud. The scraping sound was its fingers sliding across the bronze. Suddenly it froze. Slowly, with a dry crack of its neck vertebrae, it began to turn its head. The red embers in its empty sockets found them. The room filled with a sense of icy, all-consuming evil. The creature straightened to its full, unnatural height. It opened its mouth in a silent scream, and Alaric saw that behind its blackened teeth there was nothing but darkness. Finn, letting out a furious roar, raised the sledgehammer above his head. Alaric held the crucifix out before him, his hand shaking. And the creature, pushing off from its defiled altar, lunged at them. The creature's movement was unnaturally fast. It didn't run, it glided through the gloom, covering the distance between itself and the men in an instant. Its clawed fingers were aimed not at the priest with his holy symbol, but at the old man clutching the raw physical threat, the sledgehammer. Finn was no coward. He had dealt with death and its trappings his entire life, and fear in him had long given way to a fatalism as hard as grave soil. He met the attack not with a step back, but a step forward, swinging the heavy sledgehammer in the confined space. The metal whistled through the foul air. But the creature was faster. It ducked under the blow with the agility of a spider, and the heavy hammer crashed into the stone wall, sending out a shower of sparks. Before Finn could regain his balance, the creature struck. Its clawed hand slashed the old man across the shoulder. Fabric and skin parted like wet paper, and dark blood spurted out. Finn grunted in pain but did not release his weapon. He staggered back, his back hitting the wall, and tried to swing again. "Exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus!" Alaric's voice, trembling with terror but strengthened by faith, cut through the silence. He stepped forward, holding the crucifix out like a shield. "In nomine Patris, et Filii et Spiritus Sancti!" The silver crucifix flared in the lantern light like a small sun. When its light touched the creature, it recoiled, and for the first time, a sound escaped its dark mouth. It was an inhuman, serpentine hiss, full of pain and fury. The red embers in its eye sockets burned brighter, focusing on Alaric. It left the wounded Finn and took a step toward the priest. Slowly, as if wading through an invisible barrier. Each inch was a struggle. The hissing grew into a low, guttural growl. Alaric understood. His faith was a weapon. It caused the creature pain, but it could not destroy it. It was too strong, too tied to this place. He could see that even as it retreated, the creature never took its burning eyes off the bell, as if drawing strength from it. "Finn! The bell!" the priest shouted, not taking his eyes off the approaching nightmare. "Hit the bell!" The old gravedigger, clutching his wounded arm, gritted his teeth. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with determination. He saw that the priest was distracting the creature, buying him precious moments. Leaning against the wall, he raised the sledgehammer. It felt 10 times heavier than before. The creature was now just a few steps from Alaric. The priest could feel the icy breath of death emanating from it, could see the clawed fingers reaching for his face. He continued to shout the words of the prayer in Latin, pouring all his spirit, all his hope into them. And at that moment, a deafening blow rang out behind him. Finn, gathering his last strength, had brought the sledgehammer down on the edge of Gabriel. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't the pure, melodic chime for which bells were cast. It was a dull, jarring, painful groan. Clang, as if the very soul of the metal had cracked. The vibration shook the walls, the floor, their very bones. The creature's reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. It froze, and then its contorted body arched backward. A piercing, heart-rending shriek erupted from its mouth, real, loud, and full of agony. The scream mingled with the fading echo of the wounded bell. The creature staggered away from Alaric, clutching its head with its bony hands, as if the sound was causing it unbearable physical pain. The red embers in its eye sockets flickered and almost went out. "Again!" Alaric yelled, seeing that their only hope was working. Finn, swaying, swung again. But the creature, even in its agony, was not helpless. Its instinct, its connection to the idol, was stronger than the pain. With a savage snarl, it spun around. Forgetting the priest, it lunged at the old man who had dared to desecrate its shrine. It moved with the same lightning speed, but now its movements were filled with a berserker's rage. Finn only had time to raise the sledgehammer in defense. The creature slammed into him, and both of them, the old man and the monster, crashed to the floor at the foot of the bell, next to the lifeless body of Elspeth. The sledgehammer flew aside, clattering against the stone. The lantern, which Alaric had placed on the floor, was knocked over, and its light began to dim. In the semi-darkness, the priest could only see a desperate struggle, a hunched figure on top of the old man, and he heard Finn's hoarse cries, which quickly turned into a gurgling cough. For a moment, Alaric stood frozen, paralyzed by horror. The sounds of the struggle at the foot of the bell were short and terrible, a crack, a wet tearing sound, and the old gravedigger's final, deathly rattle. Then, all fell silent. The lantern, lying on its side, cast a distorted, flickering shadow on the wall, in which the hunched figure slowly rose from Finn's still body. In that moment, something inside Alaric broke. Fear, reverence for his holy office, hope for divine intervention, it all burned away, leaving behind only the white-hot ash of rage and despair. He was no longer a priest facing a demon. He was a man, trapped in a stone cage with a monster that had killed his only ally. He dropped the crucifix. The silver symbol of faith clattered onto the stone floor, now a useless trinket. With eyes accustomed to finding solace in sacred texts, he now sought what was needed most, the sledgehammer that had been knocked into the corner. With a low, animalistic snarl, he lunged for it. The creature, finished with the old man, was slowly turning. Its clawed fingers were wet with fresh blood, and the red embers in its eye sockets were reigniting, focusing on a new target. Alaric gripped the heavy handle of the sledgehammer. It was made for the hands of a blacksmith, not a priest, but now it felt like an extension of his own arm, the only argument in this dispute with a nightmare. He didn't wait for an attack. With a cry full of grief and fury, he charged forward. He didn't aim for the creature. He remembered its agony from the blow to the bell. His target was the idol. The altar. The heart of this evil. The creature understood his intent and hissed, lunging to intercept him, but Alaric already had momentum. He rushed past it, feeling claws tear at his cassock, and put all his strength, all his fear, and all his hatred into the blow. Krang! This time the sound was even more terrible than the first. A loud, jarring, shrieking groan of metal. A hideous, dark crack ran down the bronze side of Gabriel from the point of impact. The creature howled as if the hammer had struck it directly. It fell to its knees, its whole body convulsing. Its silent scream was visible even in the dim light. Its jaw hung open, revealing a black void. Alaric didn't stop. He was possessed, transformed into a machine of destruction. Again and again, he raised the sledgehammer, bringing it down on the desecrated bell. With each blow, the crack grew, spreading across the bronze like a black spiderweb. With each blow, the creature thrashed on the floor, its shrieks growing weaker, the red lights in its eye sockets dimming. It was a monstrous symphony. The crash of the hammer, the scream of splitting metal, and the death cries of a being whose life was bound to this cursed idol. But the creature did not give up. Even as it was dying, it was true to its duty. Gathering the last remnants of its unholy power, it stopped screaming. It began to crawl. Not toward Alaric, but toward the wall where the thick, dusty bell rope hung. Its goal was no longer to kill. Its goal was to complete the ritual. One ring. Just one, final ring to finish what it had started. The priest saw it. Through the haze of rage, he realized what the monster was doing. It was a race. A desperate race at the top of a cursed tower. No! He roared, raising the sledgehammer for a decisive blow. His muscles burned. His lungs were bursting for air. He put everything he had left into that final strike. At the very moment the creature's blackened claws touched the rope, the sledgehammer crashed into the heart of the crack. There was no sound. Or rather, there was the sound of the end of all sounds. A deafening, tearing crash, a screech, and a splintering. Gabriel could not hold. A huge chunk of bronze from the bell's lip broke off and fell to the floor with a thunderous boom, nearly hitting Alaric. The bell, once the pride of Oakhaven, was now just a mangled, shattered hulk of dead metal. And in that same instant, everything stopped. The creature, which had just begun to pull the rope, froze. Its bony hand remained on the rope. The red embers in its eye sockets flared brightly one last time and went out, as if 2 candles had been snuffed out. With a dry rustle, like the sound of crumbling parchment, the unholy energy that held it together dissipated. What had been Elias collapsed to the floor, becoming a pile of grey dust, decayed bones, and tattered scraps of a shroud. An absolute, deafening silence fell. Alaric stood, breathing heavily, leaning on the sledgehammer. In the light of the nearly extinguished lantern, he saw the horrific scene, the mutilated bell, a pool of blood where Elspeth's remains lay, Finn's motionless body, and the pile of dust by the wall. He had won. But the price of this victory was terrible. And then, from below, from the spiral staircase, came a noise. The sound of many heavy footsteps and angry, frightened voices. And then he heard a cry, full of grief and fury, that made his heart run colder than the touch of the undead. "Father! What is happening here?" It was the voice of Thomas, the blacksmith. And he, along with the other men of the village, was already climbing the stairs. The first to appear in the doorway was Thomas. His enormous body almost completely blocked the light of the torches carried by the men behind him. The blacksmith's breathing was heavy and ragged after the rapid climb up the stairs. His eyes, accustomed to the heat of the forge, paused for a moment, trying to make sense of the scene before him in the flickering light of the fire and the dying lantern. And the scene was irrefutable. He saw his priest, Father Alaric, with a crazed look in his eyes smeared with soot and something dark. In his hands the priest clutched his, Thomas's, forge hammer. At Alaric's feet lay the shattered, desecrated Gabriel, the pride and symbol of their village. And further on, in the shadows, lay two bodies. One was old, respected Finn the gravedigger, in an unnatural position with his chest torn open. And the second, Elspeth. It wasn't a shout, but a strangled groan, full of unbearable pain. Thomas took a step, then another. He fell to his knees beside his wife's body, not daring to touch her. His broad shoulders began to shake. Behind him, the other men crowded into the belfry. Their torches illuminated the full horror of the slaughter. A murmur, which turned into angry shouts, filled the small chamber. To them, everything was clear. Their search for a wolf in the woods had been a lie. While they were wandering through the thicket, the real beast was here. The priest. The outsider. He had lured Finn and Elspeth to the belfry, murdered them, and then, in a fit of madness or demonic possession, destroyed the holy bell. You! Thomas slowly rose. Tears streamed down his grimy cheeks, but there was no longer grief in his eyes. Only boiling black hatred. He pointed a trembling finger at Alaric. Murderer! You killed her! Thomas, it's not what you think! Alaric's voice was hoarse and cracked. He was at the end of his strength, both physical and mental. There was a monster here! A monster! It came from Elias's grave! He pointed to the pile of dust by the wall. There! That's all that's left of it. It killed them and I stopped it. The men looked at the pile of dust and bones, then back at the priest. In their eyes, his words were nothing but the ravings of a madman, a pathetic attempt to escape justice. A monster? Growled one of the farmers, clutching a pitchfork. I only see one monster here. The one in the cassock. He has defiled the house of God. Sacrilege! Shouted another. He summoned the devil, and it aided him in his black deeds. Thomas took a step toward Alaric, his hands clenching into fists the size of stones. You lie. You've been lying to us from the start. About the wolf, was that Finn's idea? Why? Why did you do it? I was trying to protect you. Alaric cried out desperately, taking a step back. His back hit the cold stone wall. He was trapped. You wouldn't have believed me. Finn knew. He helped me. And he died saving all of you. But his words were drowned out by the roar of the enraged crowd. They didn't want to listen. Their simple, understandable world had been shattered. Their wife, their friend, had been murdered. Their holy relic destroyed. And the culprit was standing right in front of them. Fear and grief had fermented into a rage that demanded an outlet. Seize him! Roared Thomas. Alaric dropped the sledgehammer. It fell to the floor with a dull thud. He wasn't going to fight. With whom? With his flock? With the people he had come to protect and guide. He raised his hands as a sign of surrender. Two pairs of rough hands grabbed him, twisting them behind his back. Someone tore the pectoral cross from his neck. They pushed and hit him, dragging him out of the belfry and down the spiral staircase. He didn't resist. He only looked at the hate-distorted faces of the people he had considered his parishioners just that morning. They threw him out of the church into the cold night air. Alaric fell to his knees on the damp ground. Before him, illuminated by torches, stood the entire village. Men, women, even children, all looked at him with the same expression of horror and disgust. He had saved them from an unimaginable nightmare that threatened to consume their souls. But in their eyes, he was that nightmare. He was the bell-ringer who had brought only death to Oakhaven. To the forge with him! Ordered Thomas, his voice now that of a judge and executioner. Lock him up. In the morning, we'll decide what to do with this devil. Alaric was pulled to his feet and dragged down the hill toward the village. He didn't look at the people. His gaze was fixed on the black mass of the church. On the silent tower, where the bell would never ring again. The silence he had hated so much had finally become eternal. And that silence was the sound of his defeat. The night in the forge was longer than eternity. Alaric was thrown into the coal shed, a cramped, dark room that smelled of dust and cold. He sat on a pile of coal dust, the blackness around him matching the one that had settled in his soul. The physical pain from the beatings was nothing compared to the pain of total, crushing defeat. He had saved their bodies but lost their souls. And his own. His faith, having withstood the test of supernatural horror, had shattered against human hatred. He heard voices outside the door. Angry, mournful, frightened. They were deciding his fate. He couldn't make out the words, but the intonations were more eloquent than any speech. He knew what awaited him. They wouldn't hand him over to the bishops or the king's justice. Their justice would be swift, primal, just like their fear. Toward morning, the door opened. Thomas stood on the threshold. The blacksmith looked as if he had aged 20 years. The fire of rage in his eyes had died out, leaving only a scorched emptiness. He said nothing. He simply nodded toward the outside. Alaric stood up. His legs wouldn't obey. His body was broken. He walked out of the shed. All the men were gathered in the village square. Their faces were stern and resolute. Some held ropes in their hands. He wasn't led anywhere. He was simply brought to the center of the square and left to stand. Thomas approached him. "We will bury our dead," he said in a dull, lifeless voice. "And then you will leave." Alaric looked up at him in surprise. "Leave," the blacksmith repeated, not looking at him. "Go wherever your eyes take you. But if we ever see you in these parts again, we will hang you from the nearest oak. We want no more killing. Not yours, not ours. Just go. Take your curse with you." It was worse than death. It was exile. An erasure from memory. He was no longer a priest, no longer a man. He was just a curse that needed to be cast out. He said nothing. Words were useless. He turned and began to walk. Past the houses with their shuttered windows, past the people who looked at him as if he were a ghost. He walked down the road leading out of Oakhaven, without looking back. When he reached the top of the hill, he couldn't resist and cast one last glance behind him. The village lay in the morning mist, and above it, like a tombstone, rose the church with its mutilated tower. A church without a bell. A village without faith. Epilogue. 10 years later. The village of Oakhaven never recovered. Not long after those events, Thomas the blacksmith left, selling his forge for a pittance. He couldn't live where every stone reminded him of Elspeth. Others followed. The harvest grew poor, as if the land itself refused to be fertile under the shadow of the desecrated church. The story of the mad, murderous priest was told in whispers, and it grew new, gruesome details with each telling. St. Giles' Church stood abandoned. No priest sent by the bishop could stay there for long. They felt a crushing silence and a cold that neither prayers nor fire in the hearth could dispel. Eventually, the parish was dissolved. The church doors were boarded up, and it slowly fell into ruin under the assault of wind and rain. One autumn, when the trees were shedding their crimson leaves, a traveler wandered into the dying Oakhaven. He was a haggard man in middle age, dressed in rags, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held a look of endless sorrow. None of the remaining villagers recognized him as Father Alaric. He didn't enter the village. He climbed the overgrown path to the ruins of the church. The doors had been torn from their hinges. Desolation reigned within. The wind whistled through the empty nave, where grass grew through the cracks in the flagstones. Elias's gravestone remained shifted, a black gash like an unhealed wound in the heart of the sanctuary. He climbed the belfry. The steps crumbled under his feet. At the top, in the chamber, the shattered remains of Gabriel lay covered in rust and bird droppings. Alaric walked over to them and ran his hand over the cold, dead metal. He had done what he had to do. He had saved them. But no one would ever know. His sacrifice was forgotten, his name cursed. He was the bell ringer who had silenced the bell forever. He stood there until sunset, looking out over the deserted village. In the falling twilight, he thought he could hear it again. Not a loud toll, no. Just the quietest, most mournful echo, born of memory and the wind. Dawn. And that single, ghostly sound was his eternal penance.